The next speaker is Michael Newton.
Yes.
Would you mind introducing yourself, Michael?
So, hello, I'm Michael. As you can hear, I originally sort of hail from the British Isles, vaguely. Currently living in Italy, working remotely as a software developer, I think is the big bit in terms of what you need to know for the talk.
I see. Out of curiosity, why Italy? I know plenty of Italian developers, software developers, who, guess what? They moved to England.
So let's go with two things. So I'm going to say Brexit, and I'm going to leave that one there because let's not have that discussion. And then the other one, which is possibly more universal, is my wife is Italian, and my parents-in-laws live in a small town just north of Rome. So, given I was working for a company in America anyway,
I see.
Yeah.
Do you ever get weird cravings, like, I don't know, beef Wellington or stuff that you can find around here?
No,
Not really.
cheddar cheese. That's kind of.
Oh, God. Really?
Yes.
Are you not happy to leave that behind you? Wait, you also stay here in the north, right?
No, I'm in Viterbo,
Well, isn't Viterbo... Wait, what's the region?
Lazio.
Oh, Lazio, right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Pecorino,
Yes.
Parmigiano Reggiano.
Yeah. Asiago. Yeah. No, it's good cheese.
But you still want cheddar.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Okay. So, please give it up for Michael.
So, yes, this is a very odd talk for me because I have been doing conference talks quite a long time at this point. I have had a relatively successful career in sort of software, and most of my talks have been about fairly esoteric technical things that I got interested in, and then I gave talks about. So, the first talk I gave was about type providers for F#, which are effectively kind of compiler plugins and so on. Whereas this is something totally different and seemed much more appropriate for this particular conference, which is talking about the features I have found in programming languages, which over the years I've realized are actually my accessibility tools for programming for my ADHD. So I have spent, sorry, I'm losing my microphone. I've spent most of my adult life very, very tired. And I spent quite a lot of time sort of talking to various doctors about it. They did blood tests and, all the things that are causing fatigue and all this kind of stuff. And never really finding anything, and life just seemed quite hard. And in the meantime, I got married, had a son, job was going reasonably well. But I was just fatigued a lot of the time. And then eventually, in sort of my, a few years ago, well into my 40s, I came across a podcast with a guy called Mads Torkelson, who some of you might recognize the name. He's the head language designer for the C# programming language, where he talked about his diagnosis with ADHD and mentioned the fact that he had got the diagnosis because of chronic fatigue, in effect. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to spend some time talking about ADHD and what it is. I'm going to spend some time talking about things I found in programming languages which help me and why. And I'm going to spend some time talking about the fact that as programmers, we like to think of ourselves as very logical, and we like to think of things as being better or worse or provable or not provable. And I'm going to kind of make the case that actually that isn't really how we make a lot of the technical decisions that we do. What we really do is we pick the things that work for us, and then we overgeneralize, because that's what humans do about everything. So let's go with it. So what is ADHD? The quick answer is it's not really anything, in the sense that, as with many medical conditions... Sorry, I hope you can read my handwriting. I decided it would be appropriate if the slides were quite messy, because my brain is quite messy. So I was sort of struggling for that bridge between handmade and legible. So hopefully it's legible. ADHD, like many medical conditions, doesn't really exist, in the sense of it's not that they know that there is a thing that causes these effects. It's the reverse. There is a group of symptoms that are grouped together often enough that medics have decided it's useful to give them a name. But that doesn't necessarily mean because you have those group of symptoms, you have it for the same reason as somebody else who has the same group of symptoms. So I'm not an expert, and don't take any of this as medical advice. I'm mainly going to be talking about my own experience. And on the one hand, I want to sort of share things that you may spot in yourself or in others that may be useful, sort of going, oh, maybe I should think about that. And on the other hand, I don't want to sort of give the impression that everybody who has ADHD has the same life experience I do, because that won't be true either. And the symptoms that sort of go into it, you can read paragraphs as description, but fundamentally... Sorry, get this to stop sliding. Fundamentally, they boil down to a continuous struggle with executive function, which has lasted for your whole life. So it's not that you struggle with it now, or that you struggle with it because you're tired. It's something that's ongoing. And that is really sort of the only common cause. And this initially comes across as quite strange to quite a few people, because especially in sort of the Anglo-Saxon world, sort of the US and the UK, when you talk about ADHD, normally the context it comes up with is school kids who are being excessively hyperactive in classrooms and disrupting the classroom. And you're kind of going, how does that translate to a lack of executive function, when executive function is defined as knowing what you want to do and then doing it? So executive function is that ability to sort of join up your desires with actually making them happen. And that can be very short term. You know, I've been told I need to sit still for an hour. Can I actually sit still for an hour? And that can be very long term. It's like, I want to go on holiday in Greece. Oh, actually, I need to plan in advance. I need to book tickets. I need to do whatever else. And executive function kind of covers that whole range. And so if you think back to what they were saying, effectively sort of putting that together with the symptoms that make up ADHD, that means to get a diagnosis of ADHD, you have to have experience from childhood that is ongoing, where there is ongoing examples of you knowing what you want to do, knowing that you can do it, and not doing it. And the final part, which is where it gets really weird and where I don't understand psychologists at all, is that the threshold for whether or not you get the diagnosis is not how much you struggle with this, it's how much distress it causes you in your daily life. So you can have someone who neurologically has much worse symptoms than me, but because they do a job where they do not need to exercise executive function to do their job on a day-to-day basis, they wouldn't necessarily get a diagnosis because it's not causing them issues in their life. So the last example is there for a reason. Looking back, the first really strong sign I had that I had ADHD was that for as long as I was in secondary school in the UK, there's very little coursework, or at least when I was going through secondary school, there's very little coursework in the English system. And so basically you turned up and you got given a piece of homework, and it would generally need to be handed in within a week, and you built up to a final exam, and you needed to know the information for the final exam, and then you could do the exam and you were done and you forget about it. And it was very structured. You know, your teachers told you, you need to learn this now, you need to learn this next. And so you'd go off and you'd learn it, and there you were. I did really well at school. No one sort of suspected I had problems with attention or anything. And then I got to university, where the environment is kind of like, hey, you've got 3 months to study yourself on this topic. You know, arrange your own study plan, make sure you learn this thing. Oh, and then next term, we're going to build on all the stuff that you taught yourself last term, you know, obviously with the help of lectures and things, and do stuff. And I just crashed and burned. I just about passed my first year. I never went back to university because in the meantime, I got a job over the summer because I lost my university funding because of my performance in the first year. And there we go. So that was kind of like the first hint, as it were. So what does it feel like? This is where things get weird, because basically I didn't realize for a long time that my experience of life was any different to anybody else's, because as humans, we associate vocabulary with what we assume it means to other people because of what it means to us. And so a lot of the things you hear people talking about with ADHD, you'll go, yeah, well, doesn't everybody do that? And to an extent they do, because the way the mechanisms work is like, yeah, if you get tired, if you get stressed, if you have had lots of changes in your life recently where you've been needing to make big decisions, you will suffer executive function failure, because humans in general do not have an infinite capacity to carry on doing things sort of regardless of circumstances. And I think the thing that sort of struck me hardest was two different comments by two different people at very different times. And one was when shortly after I met my wife, I think it was probably the first anniversary of us getting together. It might have been the second. I missed the date, as you do. And my wife made the comment of, well, but if you really care about things, you'll remember them. And I was just like, what? And then she's like, yeah, but if this day is really important to you, don't you sort of wake up and know that today is? And I was like, no. It's like, where does that come from? And it never occurred to me that that's not how most people think. And it turns out one of the common sort of shared experiences of ADHD is sometimes referred to as temporal blindness. That we tend to have a much looser connection between how recent a memory feels and how recently it actually happened, on the one hand. And we don't tend to remember to do things at a particular time of date. So, my wife will say things like, oh, I'm going to remember at 3:00 this afternoon to do this thing. And it's like, no, I need a reminder or it's not happening. So that's one side of things. And then the other side of things was the psychiatrist who actually assessed me a few years ago, once I got as far as like having the assessment and things. He made the comment that he was adjusting the dosage of the medication I use because I'm someone with ADHD who can be helped by medication. Not everybody who has ADHD has it for the same reason, so that can be hit or miss. And he was saying, it's like, oh, so, you decide to do something, and then you need to start doing something, and then you need to do something. I was like, yeah. And he was like, most people don't have that bit in the middle. They decide to do something, and then they're doing it. But there isn't an effort to transition between those two states, assuming that it is actually something that they want to do themselves. And I was like, oh, okay. That's weird. I hadn't realized that one. And he was like, we'll know that we've got the dosage of the meds right when, during the period where the meds are working at full strength, you don't have that division. You want to do something, you decide you're going to do it, and you start, and there isn't a gap in between. There isn't a sort of preparation period. So the reason that it often manifests then as fatigue when it's diagnosed in an adult is something that probably is excessively prevalent in sort of the programming community, because it turns out that if you have good verbal reasoning skills and ADHD, what will often happen in sort of the way the modern society works is that you can compensate for the ADHD by firefighting all of the chaos that you cause for yourself and by sounding intelligent. And, that sort of creates a good impression and people assume you're competent even if you're actually not necessarily, and then you can sort of bridge the gap fast enough to keep up with life. But that's actually very tiring, especially when sort of each thing that you do takes another sort of hit out of your very limited executive function. And so the moment where, there'd been some build up and I'd listened to this podcast with Mads and I sort of realized, oh, that sounds a bit familiar. And, but is there actually even there? Is there not? And the reason that it sort of triggered my, actually, no, I need to do something about this, is that there was one day where I knew that I needed to do the washing up, and it just reduced me to tears. I literally broke down in the kitchen and cried because I couldn't make myself do the washing up. And I was just like, that's not normal. That's not a life experience that most people have. So I'll get to that in just. the question then becomes, I'm having this struggle with life. I'm constantly fatigued, but at the same time, I'm doing conference talks. I was working as a consultant for a while. I'm sort of working as a senior developer in a remote team, mentoring other developers. And it's like, how is this working? You know, it's like, how am I getting work to work, even while the rest of life is obviously got something fundamentally wrong with it? And this coincided with a sort of change of work environment where I'd gone through a period over several years of interacting a lot with people in the Ruby community for different reasons, primarily teaching them functional programming, which is more my background, and talking to more and more people who sort of had that different background and realizing that some of my assumptions about why I didn't like dynamic programming and why I thought functional programming worked better and static types were great, it's like, actually, they had some really good reasons that they didn't necessarily agree with me. And I was like, okay. And then I got the ADHD diagnosis, and I was looking at life, and it's like, so, you know, how am I doing this? I began to realize that we talk a lot about sort of better and worse ways of doing programming. And in fact, we even talk about best practices quite a lot. And I still have lots of opinions on programming. And I still have lots of preferences on programming. And if you'd asked me like 10 years ago, I would have said that I knew some things about programming, things that were better or worse. And I'm more and more coming to the opinion that there are some things I still think are definitely worse. But there are actually a lot of things which are not as certain as I assumed they were. So I like type systems, and I'm going to get into why in a moment. But it turns out that I'll link to a list of links at the end. But it turns out there's actually a really nice literature review by a guy called Dan Liu, who wanted to look into the literature around whether strongly typed programming languages actually lead to code bases that have less defects and are more maintainable over the long term. And he basically came to the conclusion that there is absolutely no empirical proof at all that this is true. Not that it isn't true or that it is, but just that fundamentally we do not have the evidence to support that as a statement. Another example is that I really like property-based testing. It, for me, fits a really nice sort of niche and being able to cover a lot of ground very quickly, and you can think about how you're going to solve the problem rather than writing lots and lots of little repetitive things to solve the problem. And it's like, this is great, fantastic. Except that there are some really nice counterpoints from sort of a guy called Brian Marek, who does a lot of testing with the Agile community, where he's saying it's like, oh, I really like some of the ideas of property-based testing, but have you looked at these past papers that looked at partition-based testing? And I'll get into what this is a little bit more in a moment. Partition-based testing, and basically they make the case fairly clearly and sort of on a fairly sort of solid logical basis that there's actually quite a small category of problems that you will get improved reliability by using partition-based testing. I was like, okay. So, yeah, that's kind of another one. And the final one, this one I don't have sort of papers or anything for, but I got into a long discussion with somebody in the previous place I worked, because we were talking a lot about domain-driven design, and domain-driven design has this idea of bringing the language from your product. And obviously, for those of you working sort of on embedded systems and things, this is probably a slightly different world. But if you're working on sort of a business product, and you have users and customers who are interacting with your product, domain-driven design has this idea of ubiquitous language, the language which applies everywhere kind of thing for everybody. And the big idea from domain-driven design, there's whole books on like weird technical things that various authors have suggested doing with it. But the really big central idea is pretty simple. It's basically use the language that your users use to describe the problem in your code, so that you can run through the logic of your code with the people who are the actual experts in what it's supposed to be doing, and you're both using the same language to describe what's happening, and then your code mirrors that. And I had this long discussion with someone who was basically saying that he felt this was bringing unnecessary cognitive load onto the developers, because it was like, now they don't just need to know Ruby, they need to know all of this technical language from the domain space as well. I was thinking, yeah, I kind of see it, sort of. Not sure. that one I'm less convinced by. But it did make me think about this. It's like, okay, why did I, when I started programming, latch on to these things which are not actually particularly common in the industry? They're not sort of particularly well-known techniques. They're not sort of the normal way of doing things so strongly as things that for me immediately felt, this is a better way. This is the way that things should be done. And then I also started looking into what's ADHD and how does it work and how does it affect people. And I began to realize, actually, I'm not doing this because it's better. I'm doing this because these techniques compensate for my weaknesses. I had slides for these. So yeah, talking about ADHD. So last night, I have medication, but it kicks in about 5-hour sort of windows. So last night, I had run out of medication. Dinner had got a bit delayed because the restaurant we tried to go to was closed. And so I got to the hotel a bit later than I meant to. And I had one slide left to do on my slide deck. And what I actually did was I spent 2 hours wondering, ooh, I just got a tablet which has a stylus. I wonder if I can screencast slides so I can doodle on them whilst I'm talking. And then it was 1 o'clock in the morning and I hadn't done the last slide. So that's kind of, and then you wonder why you get tired after like 30 years. Anyway, so I like types. And lots of people make lots of arguments for types. And I will make some more arguments for types. And most of those arguments tend to be around reliability and about proving that the code is correct. And I like doing both of those things. But I will tell you the one fundamental reason that I like types, which is that I forget to type things a lot. So I will get halfway through a function, like here. I need a bigger cursor. Sorry, I hope that's vaguely visible. If I wave it around, macOS will make it bigger. And then my favorite trick in Python is I forget return statements, and then I try and call the function somewhere else, and it's like, why is this in null? It's like, this code can't return null. And it's like, oh, it doesn't return anything. The other thing is that it's very common for people with ADHD not to be terribly good at spelling, and I am indeed not terribly good at spelling. And so I tend to make quite a lot of spelling mistakes in my code. And so if I'm writing in dynamic languages, I frequently do not find out about my spelling mistakes until I try and run the code, which for me seems a depressingly large feedback cycle for swapping the order of 2 letters in my code. That is an enormous time saver for me, to get immediate feedback in my editor of, you mistyped this. And I cannot sort of explain how much more pleasant an experience that makes programming for me. And I have huge respect for some of the dynamic languages. I would love to get into Lisp because I really enjoy metaprogramming. But the loss of effectiveness for me of not having that feedback is just too big. And I've gradually realized that actually that trade-off is not right for everybody else. You know, I went through this whole period where I assumed this is just the superior way, but there are problems with types. You know, there are programs where you know that the program is correct. You know it's going to do what you want it to, but actually proving that in any meaningful way to a type system would be incredibly hard. And there is also the fact that once you get beyond the simplest programs, you are now actually talking about 2 separate skills. And this is important because the moment you start adding types to programs on a sort of fundamental logical level, and there's even proofs for this, you are writing a theorem about whether or not your program follows certain classifications, you know, certain constraints. And writing theorems is not a trivial skill, and it's not a skill that we teach very many people either. But for me, it's actually very helpful, because it turns out that one of the big issues in ADHD is that your working memory tends to be weaker than is normal for your level of verbal reasoning skills, verbal and non-verbal reasoning skills. And so for me, personally, it is much easier to actually split down the act of programming into 2 potentially logically more challenging aspects. How do I design the constraints on this system? And then how do I manage to write code that follows those constraints? than it is to hold in my head what are all the constraints whilst I write the code. And it took me a very long time to realize that that doesn't apply to everybody. And for a lot of people, actually, that's the reverse. That actually, for quite a few people, their working memory covers just fine the task that they need to achieve with their programming language. You know, one of the classic ones was listening to Rich Hickey talk about his hammock-driven development, where, you know, he lay down in a hammock and spent weeks thinking about how to design closure, and then he came up with a design, and it was just like, no, I'd have like 3 new pizza recipes in a role-playing game, but I wouldn't have a programming language. You know, I just wouldn't be able to do that. And suddenly the fact that Rich Hickey wrote a sort of dynamic language with metaprogramming makes a lot more sense. And I think this goes back to one of the talks earlier. You know, we talked about how communities influence programming languages, but I've been fascinated for a while about how the personality of the original author influences programming languages. I gave a whole talk about it at Lambda Days a few years ago, talking about Elm and F Sharp, which superficially look very similar, but I've had the pleasure of working with and meeting both of the original authors, and you can so see their personalities in the code bases that came out, even sort of years down the line with lots of different contributors who have taken part. And the last one is just, you know, teaching my son to program. He's now 17 and actually quite a competent programmer, but when he was about 8 or 9, there was a huge element of he just needed to see it run. You know, he didn't want to wait for it to be right. He wanted to see it do something. And I think it's sort of, I get that, especially if I'm having to interact with a new system I've never used before, a new API or something like that. It's like, you know that however good the documentation is and whatever it says is not actually going to send you back what you expect. And so you want to reach that point as quickly as possible of just show me what I'm going to get. You know, give me the thing. And types do make that harder. So there is a trade-off there. There's an interesting conversation as well that came up bizarrely on LinkedIn, which you would not expect kind of useful conversations to come up on generally, about somebody else with ADHD saying that they loved test-driven development for exactly the same reason that I like types, because he could think about the design of his code, he could get it down as a series of tests, and then he could write the code that implemented those tests. And I get it, in theory, but this is where we get into the other side of ADHD, sort of the straight downside, as it were, which is that there is a difference between the kind of test-driven development that he was talking about, which is what you might get the idea of if you read books about test-driven development, and the kind of test-driven development that I've encountered in the wild, because the idea is that you sort of give these pretty much the same as basic types. I find it quite interesting sometimes, the argument between sort of the test-driven development community and the static typing community, because fundamentally I think they're actually achieving pretty similar goals in pretty similar ways, but that's a whole other discussion. But the idea is, you know, you're writing about the properties of your code, and then you implement those, and then you go and you get that loop going, and it's like, and then you can refactor it. It's great. What tends to happen, in my experience, is that people doing test-driven development often end up in a situation where they write a whole bunch of tests which are really debugging, checking whether the code thinks it's doing what they think it's doing. And so you'll get tests that sort of say, oh, I'm going to give this mock, and it should get called first, and it should give this result, and that should cause this other mock to get called, which should do this, which should give this result. And then what happens is you get about 5,000 tests, and you swap the order of 3 lines of code, and all of the tests break. And then you have to go back through, and you have to either fix all of the tests, which for someone with ADHD is a truly painful experience. I don't quite know how to describe it. That idea of just like going through bazillions of tiny little tests, testing completely pointless little implementation details that no one should care about. Or even worse, you delete them and then you have to explain to someone why the code coverage count has gone down on the CI server. And it's like, it's because the code coverage count wasn't telling you anything. We'll come back to that when we talk about property testing later as well. Don't do code coverage metrics, please. I'll stop ranting about mocks now. So what else? What else have I chosen? Well, all of the languages I've really been interested in are very small. I really enjoyed working with Elm. It's a very small language. I've really enjoyed working with F#, which is a surprisingly small language. It has the caveat that it needs to be able to interrupt with C#, so it has a bit of cruft around the edges for sort of allowing some of that interop. And the common point around these languages is that they've chosen a sort of small number of powerful ideas that let them do what they need to do. So, this is pseudocode. It wouldn't actually work quite like this in either language, but this is roughly a comparison of sort of F# and TypeScript, where it's like Don Syme, who wrote F#, he didn't put higher kind of types into the language, partly because that would have made interoperability with C# a disaster, and partly because he thought that probably didn't need it. But he has this idea of computational expressions where you can encapsulate repetitive code for handling sort of the same type wrapper. I don't want to use the monad word because they're not quite equivalent, but you can effectively use them for most of the same things. And so, you can do this thing where you declare a certain block where you can say, oh, this is a block that knows how to handle async. And so I can do, let bang user equals the result of this async function. And in the rest of this code block, user will just be a user. The fact that I got it asynchronously, I don't need to worry about that because all of the code for doing that is in this this async wrapper. And it's like, oh, well, the data might not exist. Well, we can have a wrapper for that as well. Well, the data might be async and it might not exist. Well, that's fine. We can deal with that. And we have the same abstraction that covers all these things, whereas something like JavaScript is like you sort of add each thing. So it's like, oh, well, we can await if it's async, or we can sort of yield things if they're iterators, or we have a sort of null coalescing operator if they're optional. And then, oh, I want to put them together. And it's like, how do I actually put them together? And it sort of gets increasingly larger. And again, we come back to the working memory thing and the discrepancy between reasoning ability and working memory, and sort of where the balance of your strength lies. I'm not necessarily claiming that I have the most amazing sort of nonverbal reasoning skills in the world, but for me, it's definitely much stronger than my working memory skills. And so, yes, this is an abstraction. Yes, I did need to learn how they worked, and I had to write some of my own before I sort of really got into my head, what does this mean? What is this turning the code into when I run it? And then I knew, and I had one thing to remember. And if you've sort of looked up some of the sort of psychology, I always get my psi disciplines mixed up, of how people learn. There's this concept of chunking, where if you can take lots of pieces of information and you can find a common logical framework for them, at some point you actually just sort of chunk it into a single block, and it actually ends up consuming less of your working memory when you're thinking about things. So that's one thing. And so there are other languages I've used and I've enjoyed for different reasons. So it's like, as I said, I really like the idea of Lisps because I really like the idea of having that sort of meta-programming power and being able to have easy access to macros. But I found it really hard to write larger pieces of code in Lisps. I really enjoyed playing with Haskell because you can do really sort of insane things with it. But I struggled with the fact that every Haskell code base you look at is different because it will have different compiler options turned on, and they will have chosen different styles of doing things. And so I've always ended up coming back to languages like sort of F# and Elm, or even if I'm using a language that's more flexible, having the discussion right at the beginning of the project of like, what's the house style going to be for this project? How cursed do I think .NET is? I don't actually, bizarrely. .NET Core I've got quite a lot of time for, but yeah, separate discussion. So let's come back to types. I like types. So talking about sort of small but powerful features of programming languages, I tend to write business code most of the time. I've done very little sort of low-level programming, and so I tend to think a lot about modeling a business process, modeling a real-world thing that's going on. And so, for example, I find union types really helpful Just because, again, they give you ways of breaking down a big problem into smaller problems in a way that is easy to explain to someone else. So it's like, contact info. Okay, at the moment, it could be a phone number or it could be an email address. Now, you might be saying, oh, well, you could just implement that as like inheritance. You could have like a contact info class, and then you can inherit from it and all the rest of it. But you're missing, from my point of view, the big advantage of union types, which is that if I add a third contact info method here, this function stops compiling. And that, for me, is the killer feature, because I do not want to have to remember all of the places I need to go in the code to change things, and I like having that super clear. This is what happens with each thing in each place. And there are alternative ways of handling this. There's things like the strategy pattern and stuff like that we sort of talked about earlier. But fundamentally, this for me is one of the killer features of a language. One of the features that I find most helpful, especially when introducing other programmers to a code base. Union types are probably the clearest form of documentation of code I have found so far, and it's also compiler enforced, which is lovely. So, and also the other thing is that one thing that happens a lot in business code is we tend to have, at least fundamentally, two classes of error. And so having union types allows you to clearly sort of demark not just has my code worked or not, which you can sort of do fairly well with an exception, but also often you have the class of error, which is something wasn't working right now. I tried to take payment from their credit card and Stripe didn't respond. I tried to send an email and I got a temporary bounce back message. And so union types become a very clear way, again, of documenting sort of the different logical semantic meanings of sort of different return types from functions in a way that sort of the Java of sort of 95 really struggled with. And again, it comes down to, I find union types really helpful. They're super explicit. If you change something, it breaks everywhere until you fix it everywhere. If you add something, you have to go and handle it everywhere. And I love that. And I love the self-documenting features of them. But there are trade-offs. And, sort of one of the trade-offs is there is a sort of a lack of flexibility there. It's like, it's a lovely way of like representing a syntax tree, for example, to use the union types for it, until you want to allow people to, add plugins that add a new piece of syntax. And then it just doesn't sort of really work as a technique. So you sort of have to work around it. But yeah, I'd go with I'm quite happy with that. Domain-driven design I talked about. So this was something that I found really helpful because, again, I find it really hard to work in kind of the mid-space that a lot of what I would call enterprise developers work in. So there is a really low level that can be very helpful, and that can be low level in two ways. It can be incredibly abstract. I understand how monads work, or it can be incredibly deep from a technical level in terms of I really need to allocate this memory correctly. And then you have what is the problem that this code is actually trying to solve. And then there's a weird bit in the middle where you are writing code that's about code. It sort of talks about codey type names for doing codey type things. And I find that really hard because if you give me a task to do, one of the things about ADHD is that it becomes very hard to keep a stack of contexts. So if you give me a task to do, we need to take credit card payment from this person. All right, fair enough. And I'll get there and then I'll be like somewhere down in the stack and there'll be like a sort of HTTP call method and I'm doing something and then it's like, I've got a return code here. And then suddenly I'm sort of in HTTP state machine world and I'm thinking about how codes talk and what's the correct sort of content type encoding to return here. And by the time I get there, I've forgotten about the fact that what I'm actually trying to do is take the credit card payment. And so for me, first came across domain-driven design, and I latched onto it immediately because it took the words of the thing that I was being asked to make happen, and it went, use those in the code everywhere. Put it down in there. And so, as an example, I worked for a while in local councils, and one of the things we dealt with was people who are sort of vulnerable adults and kids. And it's like, you had all of these terms for different people, and you had lots of different types of users, for want of a better word. And so, if you just said user, what did that mean? And that could mean any number of things. It could mean one of the members of staff in the council. It could mean a teacher. It could mean one of the kids themselves if they're over 16. It could mean one of their parents, but they didn't always have their parents there because we're talking about vulnerable kids. So often they were living with foster parents or they were adopted. And suddenly it became much more helpful to know that this piece of code was about what is the guardian of the child supposed to know, because that was the term that the social workers were using. And it immediately sort of hooked the context in my brain of what is it I'm actually trying to do. So I actually think the counter-argument I was given for DDD is actually one of its advantages, because the counter-argument I was given is, oh, you're loading all of this complexity onto the developers. You're telling them they have to understand all this terminology and they have to understand the problem that the user is trying to solve. And I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not seeing the problem here. And there's an excellent blog post. It's in the sort of list of links at the end. It talks about this, talking about reality has a surprising amount of detail. And this is the other reason I like the domain-driven design idea of using the terminology that the user is using. Because if you start talking about a user, you tend to form a very simplistic mental model in your head of what a user is. But if you start talking about a guardian, then suddenly the social worker will tell you, oh, well, we need to know this and we need to know that. And the relationship to this other thing is that. And you immediately get that surprising amount of detail shoved in your face. And I actually think that's a good thing, but some people will disagree. Yes. I don't want to know about this product stuff. The idea that you don't care about the humans who are using your software, you're probably at the wrong conference. If I have had someone actually say that to me, I was gobsmacked. I need to speed up. So property-based testing, for those of you who don't know, guys, do a super quick sweep. Property-based testing is the idea that you state a property of your code. It doesn't throw exceptions. It reverses strings, whatever. And then you generate inputs and you run it 100 times and you see if it breaks. So this is one of the less well-written slides, but you can do things like you can say, oh, I want to handle phone numbers. And for those of you who have never dealt with phone numbers on international websites, it's a right pain in the backside because nobody actually types in their country code. So you get the thing that the user typed in and you get the country that they say they're from, and then you try and guess what they actually meant was their phone number. And so here we're generating country codes and phone number inputs, and we can write a property like saying, oh, once we've normalized the phone number, it should always start with a plus. Now, on the one hand, I love this because there are often a whole load of really simple tests where you just write a whole load of really simple inputs and you know what the result's going to be, and you can just scrap all of that. I know how to generate that. It's easy. But there is actually a bad side to these, which is two, in fact. One of them is it can become really tempting to write excessively complex generators to try and cover things that are actually very, very hard to property test. And almost inevitably, you end up writing a duplicate of your business logic in reverse in your generator, and that's not good. Don't do that. I have made that mistake. The other one, which comes back to please don't measure coverage as an indication of how good your tests are. If we ran the test that I just showed on the slide before, we would get 100% coverage of that method because it would try all of the different options. But the test is only testing one specific thing, which is that if you think you have normalized the phone number, does it start with a plus? It hasn't actually checked whether it got the phone number right or whether it normalized a number that it should have been able to normalize, or whether it didn't normalize, or the reverse, whether it told you that it was normalizable when it wasn't. So it will give you 100% test coverage of the code parts, but it's only actually covering one property of the function. And that can throw people. We're starting to get into dreamland now. These are features that I wish programming languages would have. We're talking about software we can love. I would love a production-worthy, sort of tested, has an ecosystem language that has dependent types and has linear types. And there's a lot of academic research out there about these things, but that's not primarily why I want them. In fact, dependent types, I can go on about those, but linear types are, for those of you who haven't come across them, they're a way that you can tell the compiler, I have a function here, and from the moment that I sort of declare this function, it needs to be called exactly once before my program terminates. And so the classic example is you call a database connection thing, and it returns a disconnect function, which is declared as a linear type that says this must be called once before the program terminates. And then you go through the program, and it's like, if you handle it only on the happy path, your program doesn't compile because you haven't disconnected if there's a failure. And if you handle it on like both the happy path and the error failure path, and that's good. But if you try and disconnect it more than once, the compiler will again fail to compile the program because it will say you're trying to disconnect from a database you've already disconnected from. And they're sort of treated as this like esoteric thing that people are doing academic research into. And it's just like, no, that's a really useful property that I just want to be able to declare in my program. And there are things you can do with dependent types that, again, they sound like, oh, you want theorem prover. And as a hobby, yes. Professionally, no. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to take something like a hash, a list of like names and values, which I know at compile time, and just get back a struct that has those fields with those values. And, a few other sort of simple tricks like that. So there we go. And then the last one, which isn't really about programming languages at all, but comes back to some comments that people were making recently about, so what are the table stakes for a programming language these days? And it's not just the actual language. It's also things like tooling, and it's stuff like automatic formatters, and it's stuff like having, if you're working in a team, a decent build process and those kind of things. And it's like, for me, those are killer features, because about once a month, I will try and push to the production branch with a half-complete piece of work. I'll just finish writing something, and I'll save it, and I'll commit it, and I'll just go push. And it's like I've just pulled from master because I'm, opening a new branch, and then, the build server will go, you're not allowed to do that. And I'm like, yeah, that's good. That's probably a good thing. And so there's also a sort of social aspect to programming, which again, I've gravitated generally to communities and sort of code bases where there are expectations of things like, there is a formatter, everybody uses it, it does not have very many configuration options. And it's like, even if I don't like the format it produces, we were talking earlier about the cognitive load of having a style within the community. It's like, that makes a really big difference for me. And the other one I really hate is have you ever worked in an environment where someone has told you, oh, but before every commit, could you just make sure you do, and then they tell you to run a series of automatic tools? And I'm just like, no. I have introduced continuous integration to at least 3 places where I've worked, because having had it once, I realized that I could never actually professionally work without it again. So, yes. So there we go. That was sort of a whistle-top tour of why I like some of the things I like, why they work for me, why I've learned over the years that they don't necessarily work for everybody else. There is a link to my blog in my speaker profile on the website, which is probably the easiest way to do that, because I realized after I'd posted the convenience link that it has the date in, so it's not actually very convenient. But there you go. And that's about what I've got.
Thank you very much. So are there any questions? We're going to do just a couple because we're running a little bit late. Not a lot of time.
Sorry.
It's fine. Let's go.
I have a question,
Oh,
actually.
you have a question. Yeah.
Yes.
And you're going first also. That's fine. No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so I heard you were having trouble with, like, for example, for unions. You mentioned union types, right? For getting errors when you change a union type, for example, right?
Yeah.
You add a new, like, type to a new field or whatever. How do you feel about, like, editor tooling, like, find all references, stuff like that? Does that help you with that, maybe?
So, editor tooling can help, but so the thing I have is that I have a small mental stack. So it's like what I'll often find. One of the reasons I love types is I'll often find that I will write like the types of an API, and then I'll go halfway through writing the code, and I'll like go and go coffee, and I'll come back, and I'm just like, oh yeah, I was done here, and obviously I'm not. And so the thing is that people talk about things like Ruby on Rails. I know a lot of people really love it and finding it a really sort of productive environment. I absolutely hated it because it's entirely convention driven. And so people go, it's so easy. I always know where to look for things. And it's like, yeah, it's great, but I don't remember to go and look. That's the whole problem. That's the thing I need the reminder of. So yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Good editor tooling is really useful, especially in sort of like debugging scenarios. But in terms of this side of things, it's all about having the reminders, being able to set up the reminders in advance.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. Let me pick someone else.
Let's see who Algo speaks. Hi. Firstly, thanks for discussing neurodiversity. It's much appreciated. I'm sure I'm not the only one here who feels represented, so thanks a lot.
I saw it's about 10%, as far as I can make out, in the programming community is the current guess, and that's before you get into the overlap between the autistic spectrum and ADHD, because they're often but yes.
I saw a talk recently which there was a point that was made that if you make accommodations for neurodivergent people in the workplace, then it helps everyone. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on that, or if you've got any experience or advice on that.
So I think generally that's true. The caveat is that I think sometimes it pays to play to your strengths. So, for example, at the moment, I'm working in a very small team. There's like 4 of us. The whole company is 4 of us. It's a sort of still somewhat stealth stage startup. And we all have a functional programming background, and we all have 15 years plus sort of programming experience. And so there are things that I'm doing there that I would not do in other environments, just because I already know that the people who are dealing with that code have that stuff pre-chunked, that they're kind of ready for it. So there is kind of a balancing act, I think, there of, in general, I agree. And especially when I've been working in larger teams, I've argued quite hard that it would make sense to accommodate as much as we can. The place where it starts feeling wrong for me is that some people assume that means you shouldn't use any of what they consider advanced techniques. And what people consider advanced depends entirely on their background, not actually how difficult that thing is to understand. So, yeah, I hate to give a sort of waffly answer, but I think it depends what you mean by accommodation. And for some people, that means familiar and easy. And for other people, that means this is a specific issue that I have, and this is a specific thing that would help me deal with that issue. So it can be a very difficult conversation to have, because a lot of people don't know enough about the thing that they're struggling with to be able to actually express that to you.
Let's do a couple more. I see there are so many questions, so...
Hello. First of all, thank you for the slides. They were handwritten. They were very lovely. Now, boring question. I was wondering about people with ADHD and the relationship with having a smaller working memory, and how substantiated that was within cognitive science research. Thank you.
So one of the links on my blog, if you follow that, is actually to a literature review of the link between working memory weakness and ADHD in adults. So yeah, that again we come back to, because it's symptomatic. diagnosis, that doesn't mean that everybody who has an ADHD diagnosis will have a weak working memory. But yes, it is an established correlation scientifically, and it is something that I'm aware of personally that I struggle with. So does that answer the...
Okay. Thank you very much for putting in finger on all the things you described in the first half of your talk. In the second half, you described how you cope with it in programming. But my question is, what do you do everywhere else? Like, how can I cope in normal life?
So this is all quite new for me. I mean, my diagnosis was only a couple of years ago. A couple of things for me is that it sounds really stupid, because that thing about if you care, you'll remember, that was like 20 years ago, and it hit me immediately that wasn't how I experienced life. But for some reason, that didn't click through into actually changing how I behaved. And it was only quite recently that I realized that should change how I use calendars. Because most people use calendars to kind of remember the boring stuff that they know they have to remember. Whereas I suddenly realized the things that mattered most to me were the things that everybody else didn't bother to put in the calendar because they were going to remember them anyway. Whereas I don't. So I sort of like, oh, actually, if I put the interesting stuff in the calendar, then that will get priority. The other thing is I recently found, so I'm sure there's other sort of similar things. I recently found a sort of software as a service thing called SchedPal, where you can set tasks with estimates of durations with priorities, and what it would do is you sort of hit the button and it would just put them in priority order in your calendar. But then if you don't do that thing at that time and you wait, you just hit the button again and it just recalendars everything based on what you've actually done. And I found that really helpful because one thing I haven't really talked about is that one of the things with ADHD is decision fatigue, that you reach a point where you just stop making decisions because you just can't cope with making the choice. And something like SchedPal has been really helpful for me because it's like, what am I going to do next? And it's like, I hit the button and I wait for it to suggest something. And I may agree or I may disagree, but at least I have a suggestion of a thing to do rather than just sitting there not being able to decide. So yeah, write down different things from normal people is the short version.
Nice. One last question.
Hello. I feel like you've basically described me in the first half of your talk. Like, yeah,
sorry, let me interrupt you briefly. So can you raise your hand if you saw yourself at that talk? I'm raising my hand because Francesca was messaging me saying that I actually behave exactly that way. Okay, so it's a good chunk of us.
I'm not surprised there's such an overlap, but it is, well, this is going to my question that kind of coming off of his is, I have had a lot of experiences where people know I have ADHD and can deal with it, but it's hard for them to internalize like the memory thing, where it's like, dude, like if you cared, you would have remembered. It's like, I guess. So my question is, how do you help people understand how your brain works?
Well, I put talks forward for conferences. It seems to be fun. No, I mean, obviously I've been married for 20 years, so I have quite a lot of history with my wife, and that has obviously provoked a number of conversations on both sides about things that have happened in the past. One thing I would recommend in the links, I linked to the podcast by Mads where he's talking about it. He has a really good thing where he was realizing that like, I'm really successful at work, but I'm letting my family down because I've got a PA at work. You know, he's like, oh, I'm a project leader at Microsoft. I have a PA and they're organizing it and I have priorities because they're being set by my managers. And then I get home and I'm just like, what am I doing? Yeah. How do I even do this life thing? And he talks a bit about the process of going through letting go of the guilt because it's like, oh, actually I did those things because that is how I'm wired up. And the things I was being told should work didn't. And that's not my fault. I shouldn't feel guilty about that. But keeping the responsibility. It's like, it's still my life. I still have agency. The things that most people are using don't work, but surely I can find something else. And I don't, especially because it is symptomatic and the causes of subtly different for each person who has the diagnosis. There isn't kind of a right answer, but for example, there's a list of links there to, there's a website called How to ADHD, which has sort of a whole bunch of suggestions of things, or just trying different things. I mean, I know I went through a period where I effectively just gave up on having a diary because it wasn't working and I couldn't work out how to make it work. And there was like a 4 or 5 year period where my life was just chaos because I'd given up on trying to make something work. And I suppose I'm saying, don't do that. But do be aware that the things that other people are suggesting to you, try them, but then try something new if they don't work, because the same things don't work for everybody.
Thank you. Please give it up. Thank you. Okay, we're going to come back in 10 minutes for the next talk.